COVID-19 and the brain. So what do we know about how COVID affects the brain? And in understanding this, it helps to know that there are essentially three ways that a disease impacts the brain. Three primary ways, I should say. Number one, it affects the neuron directly. Okay, in other words, an example of that might be, for example, with Alzheimer's disease, you have the plaques of the neurofibrillary tangles that basically, essentially choke off your neuronal system, for lack of a better term. So it's attacking the neuron directly. Related is it attacks the fatty sheath that surrounds the neurons, what's called myelin. Okay, and an example of that would be, for example, in autoimmune disorders such as multiple sclerosis, where it basically attacks the myelin, degrades it, and therefore the myelin, as some of you probably know, facilitates neurotransmission, so therefore it impedes neurotransmission. And then finally, the third way is that it attacks the vascular system, the cerebrovascular system. So basically causing risk factors for things like stroke, ischemic disease, aneurysms, things like that. Okay. Well, the evidence suggests that COVID-19 affects all three. Okay, that's the good news. Being sarcastic. So the problem is that up until recently, most of the information about how the coronavirus affects the brain has been through case studies from SARS-CoV-1 and MERS. And so again, many of those studies were as well done as they could be, but they weren't controlled. There weren't a lot of controlled clinical trials. Now that's changing. There are clinical trials out there that are being done, and so I would imagine in the next couple of years we'll find out a lot more. But as for now, that's kind of where we're at. So the mechanisms are not entirely known, although, like I said, we're getting better. But I think the main thing to know is as far as how the virus directly invades the central nervous system, the key thing are what are called these ACE2 receptors. These ACE2 receptors, angiotensin receptors is what that stands for essentially. What these ACE2 receptors do is that they regulate an enzyme called angiotensin. And what that basically does is, if angiotensin is allowed to kind of run amok, what it basically, among other things, it increases neuroinflammation and also breaks down cellular walls, particularly cerebrovascular walls. Okay, that's if angiotensin is allowed to just do its thing. The ACE2 receptors regulate that. Okay, so that's why, for example, if you have like the cinepril, which basically also regulates angiotensin. Okay, so the ACE2 receptors that's their job, is to do that. What the coronavirus does, you've seen the coronavirus spike. It has those protein spikes. Like a lock and key, it goes into the ACE2 receptors and basically doesn't allow it to do its job. So as a result, it cannot regulate angiotensin, and therefore you have things like increased blood pressure, increased inflammatory response, cerebrovascular cell wall breakdown, a number of stroke risk factors, you could put it, kind of in a nutshell. And the ACE2 receptors are expressed widely throughout the body, including the central nervous system and the brain. Okay, so basically you have a lot of areas where the coronavirus can latch onto these ACE2 receptors and not allow it to do its job. Some reports suggest that they're also expressed in neurons, astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, so the cleanup workers of the neuron, if you will. And is also concentrated in a number of these different brain areas, substantia nigra, middle temporal gyrus, and so forth. Particularly in the olfactory bulb. And the olfactory bulb, again, as we said, the olfactory areas is one of the direct lines from that area into the central nervous, or into the brain. Yes. To test if the receptors are working properly. No, I don't know that. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. Mark?
You can more easily know when they're not working properly. So everything you just mentioned was what I observed in my 20 patients who died from COVID over a 5-week period. We began to see hypertension, all this is very good. massive inflammation kind of things, and then on top of that, the conditioning, and then, wound care things, it just was.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think the answer to your question would be in kind of the negative, in that if they're showing signs and symptoms that they're not working, which would be all the things that you just mentioned. Yeah, so thank you, Mark. Okay, a few other comments about neural invasion and transmission, and how the COVID spreads throughout the body and eventually the brain. One thought is what's called transsynaptic spread, in that initially the virus, once it gets down into the esophagus, into the respiratory system, then eventually spreads out into the peripheral nerve terminals, and then basically just sort of spreads along the synapses, eventually getting into the central nervous system. So that's the transsynaptic spread. By crosses the blood-brain barrier by affecting endothelial cells, eventually latching onto glial cells, and eventually making its way into the central nervous system. So it kind of like fools its way in there. The other thing called the cytokine storm, which again is a pro-inflammatory marker. When the cytokines are released, the proteins, showing that inflammation has begun, and that can lead to multi-organ system failure. Now, the more common one, which what I've seen, and which is why most of my people have come from pulmonology, is because as a result, the COVID virus affects the pulmonary system, the lungs, and so forth, and you have a risk of hypoxia. Probably you know the difference between anoxia, which is no oxygen, hypoxia, which means less oxygen, and 15 minutes of substantial hypoxia can lead to brain damage. I see this a lot with my patients. I have a lot of patients who have sleep apnea, and so I somewhat equate it to that. People who have respiratory conditions and sleep apnea, because people who have sleep apnea can exhibit memory problems. And what the nice thing about that is, at least something you can treat, is potentially reversible unless it's sustained and prolonged. But again, even people with medical conditions separate from COVID who have these kind of respiratory issues can have problems in motor skills, executive functioning, learning, memory, and so forth. And then the last one, which we've kind of talked about, is the effect of the COVID virus on the cerebrovascular system, which could potentially lead to coagulopathy due to the ACE2 receptors present in the blood vessels. So those are the number of ways that the COVID-19 virus can potentially affect the brain.